time, Dave, just let me know.
Okay, man.
Started a little late here. All right, never mind the description of whatever it was I was supposed to be talking about. Here's what I actually proposed, that I took 4 pairs of novels, Dick and non-Dick. A Dick novel versus some acknowledged masterpiece of science fiction, some classic by another author. And put Eye in the Sky up there mainly because I just wanted to acknowledge where this all started for me at age 12, reading my father's paperback of Eye in the Sky with the Ed Balagursky cover, which has continued to be my favorite ace cover, or really favorite any paperback cover. And maybe some of you feel the same way. But anyway, that's definitely the Eye in the Sky that I like, the original. Okay, so the first pair of books I'm going to look at, and just I reread them back to back, all of these books, just to see what the effect would be on me of reading one of Dick's books on top of one of these classics. And in this case, I'm taking Solar Lottery and reading it on top of The World of Nale by A.E. Van Vogt. The World of Nale, okay, in 1945, August of 1945, 2 bombs went off. One was on Japan, the other was an explosion heard throughout the science fiction world, also in August of 45, and this was the serialization of World of Nale in Astounding Science Fiction. This was a Nale bomb in the science fiction field. 3 years later, the book version, this was the original hardback cover, 1948, was heavily revised from the serialization in Astounding. The hardback was published by Simon & Schuster. It was the first hardcover science fiction novel published by a major publisher after World War II. It was a huge success in France as well. It was credited with having created, all by itself, the French science fiction market, or at least this is according to Van Vogt. So, the exploding wave of paperback science fiction novels published in book form by Ace, there's the original Ace version, also published in a double novel format. Was Ace, Berkeley, Ballantine, all these publishers largely replaced the science fiction magazine market that was prevalent in the 40s. And in the mid-50s, when Philip K. Dick published Solar Lottery, it was modeled successfully along the lines of Van Vogt's masterpiece. And now I quote Mr. Nick Buchanan, who's after me, in his essay, Those We Loved, Loved Others Too. He lists a number of plot points that we might assume came from P.K. Dick's story, but in his essay, which is in Otaku 34, they actually came from A.E. Van Vogt. A man arrives for a meeting, for example, and is told that the person with his identity doesn't exist, which is a shock to him as well as everybody else. A common enough Dick problem, but in this case it happens to be in the World of Nale. If you read World of Nale and Solar Lottery back to back, as I did just now, even though I've read them a number of times before, I can't keep straight what events happen in which novel. World of Null A begins with Gilbert Gosseyn, Gosseyn, pun intended by Van Vogt. He arrives in the magnificent city of the machine to take a test to determine whether he will get one of the plump civil service jobs on Venus. Reading Solar Lottery this time, I was convinced I was going to see this scene. It didn't appear because I'd gotten the two books mixed up, although Solar Lottery has a lot of attention on civil service jobs too. That's part of the problem. And now, quoting from Dick, his interview with Charles Platt, a point came when I began to feel that science fiction was very important. Van Vogt's World of Null A, there was something about that which absolutely fascinated me. It had a mysterious quality. It alluded to things unseen. There were puzzles presented which were never adequately explained. I found in it a numinous quality. I began to get an idea of a mysterious quality in the universe which could be dealt with in science fiction. I realize now that what I was sensing was a kind of metaphysical world, an invisible realm of things half seen, essentially what medieval people sensed as the transcendent world, the next world. Reading the World of Null A now, it may not seem to be an unqualified success artistically. One thing to remember is that Van Vogt tightened the book version up considerably, losing about 10,000 words out of the serial. This was partially because he was derided in a fanzine as being a pygmy and at a giant typewriter by none other than budding critic Damon Knight. So, when it came for the book version, time for the book version, Van Vogt tightened it up. So much, in fact, that he made it almost impossible to follow the excessively complicated plot. It is probably necessary to read both versions, the serial as well as the book, in order to untangle the multitude of plot strands. The magazine version is some 10,000 words longer, as I said, and it contains some information not in the book version. But actually reading just the book and resigning oneself to some plot puzzles is probably enough for most people. The reason this was so important is, and why it hit Dick so hard, I think, is because it's a novel of cosmic dimensions, a perfect prototype for an SF novel for Dick to follow. Van Vogt's innovation was to deliver science fiction into the novel of ideas. From him, Dick learned to layer ideas into his scenes. The layering became a feature of Dick's style. Characters are layered, they're complex. Ideas are layered, they're complex. Levels of mind are layered. It's a layered cake, and the resulting density is exactly the cause of Dick's addictive style. It has an experiential, drug-like effect. Van Vogt has a bit of that addictive quality that Dick has, I think. And despite Van Vogt's interest in the mind, which I'll talk about in a minute, Dick represents it better, I think, in its inexorable restlessness. I reread World of Null A several times as a teenager because perhaps I thought the way it shifted suddenly made one reread to try to figure out the story. That level of cognitive confusion is a feature in Van Vogt, not a bug. Compared to it, most Dick novels, Solar Lottery included, are relatively straightforward. Dick himself was reasonably amused by the Van Vogtian conventions. Van Vogt has this self-imposed rule that a scene should not go more than 800 words, and it should contain a new idea. So he was shifting, when he changed scenes, he was really shifting gears in the story as well, and in the conceptual underpinnings of the story. This is why the reader is always off balance in Van Vogt. The organizing principle of the social order in Van Vogt is the null-A philosophy. Some editions of World of Null-A represent it as the bar, meaning null here, and, or they would just write it out in other cases, but it was essentially means the same thing. It is portrayed, the underpinning of null-A philosophy, or non-Aristotelian philosophy, as it's represented in the book, is actually a real philosophy called general semantics that was popular at the time. It is portrayed in World of Null-A as a physical and mental discipline which creates super powerful individuals capable of operating outside the hypnosis of the group mind. Similarly, in Solar Lottery, there is a guiding principle, which is the Minimax game, based on complete randomness. A twitch of the bottle, as it is put, determines who is the new leader of the country. In both books, the game turns out to be rigged. And this is, again, a characteristic of both the World of Null-A and Solar Lottery, with these complicated game-like structures to decide who the leader is going to be. Yet when we really get into it, beneath the surface, we find out that the whole thing is rigged all along. In Dick, the supposedly random casino game that picks the president turns out to be fixed. There's Van Vogt. Finding my slide I wanted, but anyway. Okay, I was reminded when I read that this time, the leader of the Solar Lottery system is a quizmaster, known as the Quizmaster. The 50s, there was this mania, as many of you may remember, for quiz shows. And they had Charles Van Doren, who was the star. He, from the mid-50s on, he was considered the smartest man in the world. He would answer these impossible questions on the quiz show, where won hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then by 1959, it was revealed that the whole thing was a hoax, and that he'd been given the answers in advance, as had the other contestants. So in 1955, Dick predicts all of this, which isn't made public until 1959. Now, on the issue of general semantics, which I just mentioned, is the philosophic underpinning for the World of Null-A. This was a philosophy enunciated by a man named Korzybski, and he was refuting what he called Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic was identified with Boolean logic, which is where you reduce everything to true and false. Everything is either true or false, nothing in between. So in contrast to that is the null-A philosophy. The null-A mind is always thinking outside the box. General semantics led to Dianetics, which L. Ron Hubbard introduced to the world in the pages of Astounding in May of 1950. I actually have this, a copy of this magazine, not with me, but that's what the cover was. And there you see at the bottom, Dianetics is a new science of the mind, which was the introduction to the world of Dianetics in 1950. And Van Vogt became a very public promoter of Dianetics throughout the 50s when Hubbard had morphed Dianetics into a religion. By the time Hubbard had morphed Dianetics into a religion in 1959, Van Vogt got out of it. He wasn't interested anymore. And I haven't found any evidence that Dick was either. But you can see what Dick's attitude, about null A philosophy or Scientology or Dianetics by his short story Null O. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah. It was written originally in 1953. Let's see, it was in If. It was finally published in 1958, 1958 in If magazine, which at the time was being edited by Damon Knight, who, interestingly enough, it was the reason that Van Vogt's career in the 50s was on the decline because of that image of the pygmy at the typewriter, giant typewriter. I don't think anybody could get beyond that again. The Null O is a short story that is clearly a satire on the hyper-rationalistic Null A philosophy. And I think this is one of the most pessimistic scenarios of the future Dick ever wrote. A group of scientists take over the world advocating the philosophy of Null O, which posits that a complete destruction of the world is the highest and noblest goal for humanity. It actually resembles Null A in that it is completely devoid of sentiment and empathy. In the story, a child actually convinces his psychiatrist to adopt this nihilistic philosophy. The destructive impulse spreads over the planet until there are only a few thousand people left, and they're all handymen. And of course, these are the Dickian heroes. They're down to a few thousand of them, but they manage to take over the world, what's left of it, and save a bit of remnant of humanity from the scientists, the Null O's. So, all is not lost, but pretty nearly. That's why I see it as, there's a glimmer of hope, just a glimmer. So in Null O, we see Dick's ambivalence about the whole subject of the paranormal and how it is never to be divorced from a larger philosophical grounding. Quoting Ian Watson. Ian Watson is, if you don't know, is one of the top British science fiction writers of the last 50 years. The increasing prominence of paranormal talents can too easily become a quasi-mystical escape route from real problems, ethical, psychological, epistemological, and practical. A seductive nonsense supervenes. The meaningful pole in SF is represented by Philip K. Dick, and the nonsense pole by A. E. Van Vogt. You can see where he stands. Dick invariably subsumes the paranormal within a zone of genuine social concerns, and thus avoids mystification. His precogs, time shifters, and other characters with wild talents are presented with tact, zany wit, and most important of all, in an organically structured relation to society, whether this society is human, quasi-human, or alien. Van Vogt's use of the paranormal, on the other hand, is a bag of conjuring tricks, amounting to a negation of any society, alien, human, or post-human. To a large extent, Solar Lottery can be seen as a corrective to the nonsense pole of Van Vogt, and even in terms of style, it can be seen as an improvement. Many critics noted that at the time that Solar Lottery came out, I think Anthony Boucher was one, this is the best Van Vogt novel that Van Vogt never wrote. Dick carried on Van Vogt's conceptual breakthrough style to a new level of literacy in the 50s and into the mind-altered new wave of the 60s. Again, I refer you to Nick Buchanan's article in Otaku 34 on the book. My next pairing is The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester versus The Unteleported Man by PKD. Here's where The Star's My Destination, which is acknowledged as one of the top, on practically any list you see, this is one of the top 10 science fiction books of all time. Unfortunately, I don't think Teleported Man has made anybody's list on that. Perhaps it should. So here's Alfred Bester, who was already well known for and for his Hugo-winning Demolished Man, about telepathy, and then his sequel, well, it's not a sequel, it's just the following book, The Star's My Destination, was about teleportation. So he kind of covered the psychic powers pull of things with those two books. Now, on the Unteleported Man, you're probably all aware that there is a huge editorial snafu around the publication history of this, and I won't go into all that because it would take all the rest of the time just to rehearse all the various editions, you know, that there are just a few of them. With the story of how the Unteleported Man was expanded, revised, pages lost, chapters rewritten, and finally republished as Lies Incorporated. That was in 2007, and that's the edition I reread this time. Some may feel that it were better left unexpanded in its original Ace edition, published in 1966. It's there. Now this edition of Lies Incorporated, the retitled Unteleported Man, has an afterword by Paul Williams, which goes into the history of the whole publication, and in its corrected version, with that cover on it, what I'm going to suggest is that we kind of forget all the other editions and just read the novel as a real unified work. I understand that not everybody may feel that that is the ultimate and final best form for the novel, but it's kind of where it stands as the status quo right now. Now, there's no direct link to this and Star's My Destination, but I'll tell you in a minute why I think it's appropriate that we look at the two books side by side. But the science fiction novel did not come of age until the 1950s, because when it did, with the sudden profusion of mass market paperback publishers, it basically gave birth to a new literary form. Throughout the 40s, which were regarded as the golden age of SF, the 50s were gilded in a different way. Not only were the landmark works that exploded onto the scene better written in the 50s, they extended the conceptual boundaries of the form into social criticism and consciousness speculation. Alfred Bester was one of the most influential SF writers of the 50s, primarily for the two novels that I just mentioned. The former, the Demolished Man, which came first, involved telepathic detectives. So Dave Hyde in his essays was well pointed out the carryover from the Demolished Man into Solar Lottery. So you can look that up in Otaku. But here the the telepathic detectives we see in Solar Lottery, Ubik, and other places. The latter, Stars My Destination, was an adventure story based on teleportation. In a world where everyone can instantly transmit themselves mentally across large regions, its social status becomes dependent upon how far you can teleport, or jaunt, as Bester puts it in Stars My Destination. His style, Bester's style, is what I'd call pyrotechnic, fantastical, exuberant, over the top. I think he was basically just kicking out the jams of all the established prohibitions on what you could do with style. Okay, I'm good. I'm not going to get through all my books. Now I'm just going to kind of go as far as I go in this talk. It seems like a thoroughly modern science fiction book. It could have been written yesterday. The setting is a hyper-capitalist future ruled by giant corporations. It has often been noted that The Stars My Destination is a proto-cyberpunk novel. It has the urgency of tone that we find in William Gibson, who acknowledged it as an influence. The first lines of Bester's novel are indicative. This was a golden age, a time of high adventure, rich living and hard dying, but nobody thought so. This was a future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice, but nobody admitted it. This was an age of extremes, a fascinating century of freaks, but nobody loved it. Literary echoes, Joyce, Blake, Dumas, pepper Bester's stylish landscape, providing historical depth while plunged into radical future excursions. One can legitimately question whether there is substance beneath this style. This is my opinion. At times, readers can feel exhausted by the density of characters, incidents, and sudden shifts in scene. The book is not an epic, but it reads as if it has epic scope. In short, the suspicion is that there is less here than meets the eye. Forgive me if that's heretical to say that. The main character, Gully Foyle, begins as low and rough, with much more muscle than brain, and ends up a sort of God-man, the first human with the ability to space jaunt across millions of miles. But we never know this man or feel much kinship with him. The character and the stars themselves, his destination, leave us cold in the end. Still, the journey is compelling on its own terms, and one every science fiction lover must take. So, why compare The Stars with My Destination with The Unteleported Man / Lies Incorporated? Two reasons. First, they are both about teleportation, and two, because both are psychedelic in a certain way. There may be plenty of other factors where they have nothing in common, but just to comment on these commonalities, first of all, the approach to teleportation is very different in the two novels. In Bester, this is a mental phenomenon, and the teleport range is different from person to person. Gully Foyle becomes a virtual Superman at the end of the tale by bursting through the assumed limitation on a human's ability to teleport across outer space. And in Lies Incorporated, it's the teleportation is not mental, it's entirely mechanical. It's not presented as a good thing either, but as a technology that can be misrepresented and subverted. The inventor of Telpor, an unteleported man, invents a scientific law that states teleportation can only go one way. Thus, when the largest corporation in the solar system starts teleporting willing emigrants, the fact that they are being consigned to prison camps on the distant planet of Whale's Mouth is never known because it is not expected that they would be able to return. Transmissions of fake testimonials, glowing reports of utopian conditions on the other side, are believed because there is nothing to contradict them. So, in Dick, teleportation is not a Bester case scenario, as we can see. The second half of Lies Incorporated consists of a hallucinatory episode brought on by the main character being shot with an LSD dart. The style shifts to give the effect of a real acid trip, jumbles of images, transformations piled one on top of the other, and time dilation. For example, here's an excerpt typical from, this is the second part of The Unteleported Man, which then became part of Lies Incorporated. Within him all his language disappeared, all words were gone. Some scanning agency of his brain, some organic searching device swept out mile after mile of emptiness, finding no stored words, nothing to draw on. He felt it sweeping wider and wider, extending its oscillations into every dark reach, overlooking nothing. It wanted, would accept anything now. It was desperate. And still, year after year, the empty bins where words, many of them had once been, were not now. There's a pressure of consciousness here that cannot find purchase. In describing a mental state, Dick brings powerful testimony that is surely wrested out of personal experience. So when I say both of these books are psychedelic, they are by no means in the same way. In contrast to Bester's fiery verbal pyrotechnics is Dick's dark and empty silence. Timothy Leary is not. Closer to Samuel Beckett on Substance D. How's time? Are we up? Okay, enough time to cover one more pair of books then. Childhood's End, which again, this is one of the acknowledged classics of science fiction, always ends up in the top 10 on different lists that you see, covering the entire history of the genre. Among Dick's 1960s novels, okay, I'm going to talk first about, I'm going to line this up next to Our Friends from Frog's 8, which actually it shares something in common though. This book, I feel, doesn't get much love. It may be because there is a strong air of depression about the main character, Nick Appleton. He is a tire regroover, an occupation that one might be surprised still exists in the 22nd century. But fits his personality. Nick is in love with a 16-year-old revolutionary gutter snipe, Charlotte, for whom he eventually leaves his wife and son. There are some tragic and absurd deaths, and perhaps not as much humor as we're used to in a Dick novel. Again, I'm looking for the reasons why it might not be appreciated so much. Characters have a tendency, also, in this book particularly, to rattle on endlessly, seemingly without purpose. Another cause for disillusionment about this book may be the ending, which seems to resolve very little. Of more interest is the sociological layering of this future world. There are 4 categories of people in this world: old men who possess normal intelligence but are passive and servile, undermen who are basically rebels to the authoritarian social order, new men who have highly developed brains, and unusuals who have advanced psi powers such as telepathy. The new men and the unusuals run this world with a tight grip using the PSS, an elite police corps known as the Pissers. There is a type of character we've encountered in other Dick novels, such as The Simulacra and now Wait for Last Year. It is the conflicted world leader, this time Willis Graham, who is able to enforce his despotic rule through telepathic powers. For no good reason, he falls in love with Charlotte too, the 16-year-old. She's an underman, and as such a martial arts whiz, that she escapes from 4 pisser guards that Graham is assigned to it. This intersection plunges Nick into the center of the political plot and into an advisor role of sorts to Graham. The leader of the Undermen, Thoris Pravini, has been away on a long space journey for decades and is returning with a giant protoplasmic alien in tow, Morgo Ron Wilk, from the planet Frolix 8. This alien has extraordinary powers, and upon return of Pravini's ship to Earth, the Frolixen is able to scan the minds of the new men and the unusuals and in an instant reduce them to childish idiocy. Now, it might seem that this is an overly easy solution to a difficult problem. The authoritarian government is toppled, as it deserved to be, and the unempathic brainiacs, the new men, or double domers as they are called, are out of business with just a bit of mental sabotage on the part of Morgo. Besides the political plot finding some resolution, however, the existential plight of Dick's characters remains tenuous. It is not a feel-good book. But Dick's creations always fascinate beyond what we think they should, given the technical problems we might perceive in the writing. It has something to do with the fact that he wrote so many novels, and they tend to run together in the mind because they share so many elements of a background reality. And a book like our friends from Frolix 8 benefits from that. Well, how might you ask, is our friends from Frolix 8 really the novel we want to put against, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke? Clarke's book is a masterpiece, and I won't read a sample of his writing style. It's breathtaking, it's magnificent, and it would be unfair to put Clarke's style in Childhood's End against anybody else's style, so I won't go ahead and do that here. But I just wanted to mention that that is not really an influence on Dick stylistically. It's not an influence as such. Clarke is in the lineage of H.G. Wells, Olaf Stapleton. He's not coming out of so much the genre conventions that were current in the 40s and 50s, I think. In Friends from Frolix 8, okay, in Childhood's End we have an alien race of overlords who look like demons with horns and tails, most definitely are not. They bring peace to the earth and teach humans to treat each other decently. But their ultimate job is, as directed by the Overmind, to foster the rapid development of a more evolved race of humans, essentially a telepathic cluster of minds that is joined into some kind of unimaginable merger. But in Frolix 8, the unusuals and the new men do not triumph. They collapse in autistic isolation. Dick is skeptical about the whole evolutionary vision that catapults the human race out of its present physical and psychological configuration. So his style appropriately is not poetic nor profound. He's not ushering in the next era of the development of a higher consciousness. He is trying to pierce the veil that prevents people, ordinary humans, from being conscious of themselves. Well, I'm going to have to stop there, I think, so thank you.
What was the last pair?
The last pair was Ubik versus Ursula Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven.